Good evening. I would like to welcome you all to this online Academy Discourse this evening, and indeed to Janet, our speaker, Professor Brown, who is in the United States. So I have to say good afternoon to you, Janet. This discourse is supported by the law firm of Mason, Hayes and Curran. For those people who are coming into this Academy Discourse, these discourses are the oldest and most renowned series of talks in Ireland. The first discourses were presented by the Academy in 1786, and historically Academy Discourses were the occasion reserved for the most distinguished academics to first reveal and discuss their work in public. The Academy holds 6 discourses each year. In the past few years, we have had Nobel Prize winners, internationally distinguished political figures, senior European public servants, and internationally eminent scholars, and they have delivered a broad range of discourses, most of which are currently available on the Academy's website. I'm Mary Canning, I'm President of the Royal Irish Academy, and present this evening also are the Academy Secretary, Professor Mary O'Dowd, the Academy Treasurer, Professor Patrick Honohan, and our Executive Director, Dr. Tony Gaynor. And before we begin, I just have a little short Academy business to undertake. The minutes of our last discourse with Professor Diane Negger, member of the Academy, on celebrity culture up to and in the pandemic took place on the 6th of May, and they have been posted online. Since none of our members informed us of any issues with these minutes, I will take these as approved and sign the minute book in the Academy when circumstances permit me to do so. So, turning to the business of tonight, our speaker is Professor Janet Brown, who is an honorary member of the Royal Irish Academy. Professor Brown is the Arrowman Professor in the History of Science at Harvard University. Her interests range widely over the history of the life and earth sciences and natural history. After a first degree in zoology at TCD, Professor Brown took a PhD in the history of science at Imperial College London, and she subsequently published the secular arc Studies in the History of Biogeography in 1983. Professor Brown went on to work as associate editor of the early volumes of the correspondence of Charles Darwin, followed by several years producing a biography of Darwin that integrated his science with his life and times. The biography was received with wide acclaim and was awarded the James Tate Black Award for Nonfiction in 2004, the W.H. Heinemann Prize from the Royal Literary Society, and the Pfizer Prize from the History of Science Society. Professor Brown was based in the Wellcome Trust Centre for the History of Medicine at University College London until 2006, when she moved to Harvard University. She has an honorary degree from her alma mater, Trinity College Dublin, in 2009, and she was elected an honorary member of the Royal Irish Academy in 2019. Our respondent this evening is David Livingston, member of the Royal Irish Academy and Professor of Geography and Intellectual History at Queen's University, Belfast. And following his response, we will have the opportunity for some questions from our audience, facilitated by the Academy's Senior Vice President, Professor Jerry McKenna. If you wish to ask a question, please use the Zoom Q&A function, and we hope that we will have time to answer as many of those as we possibly can. I am now turning to the discourse, which I am sure is going to be fascinating. And Professor Brown, it is now over to you, and thank you very much.
So, hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you, President Canning. I'm completely delighted to be here remotely to deliver an Academy discourse, I've found it a remarkable honor to join the Academy 164 years after Charles Darwin was elected. So it's extremely nice for me to be part of this evening's events. It's also extremely nice, before I begin, to thank David Livingstone of Queen's Belfast. David and I have many mutual interests in the history of Darwinism, and it's a real pleasure to follow in his footsteps, firstly, by election to the Academy, and secondly, this evening, to be part of the same programme. Peter Bowler is another long-standing friend and academician, and I think he may be listening in. Special thanks are due to Eric Hughes behind the scenes, who's making everything move so smoothly. And as Mary said, I'm speaking from Boston, and if circumstances had been different, I would have loved to have come over. My heart still lies in the rather short but compelling time I spent as an undergraduate at Trinity College Dublin, while the 1960s turned into the 1970s. It was an education well worth having and motivated a lot of what I've gone on to pursue. So I'm just going to open up my screen to share some pictures with you. So just give me a moment to do that. Okay, start. Here we go. So that's the title of my talk. And I have a very simple tale to tell tonight about Charles Darwin. For some years now, probably longer than I actually want to remember, I've been exploring the ways in which Darwin became, after his death, what Leslie Stephen called a noble old hero of science. And this work comprises all kinds of research into what happened after Darwin's death, for decades after Darwin's death. For example, what the biographies said about him, where his portraits were displayed, how many medals and prizes took his name, and the tangled story of transforming his house into a museum. And putting this in more concrete terms, I aim tonight to discuss Darwin's autobiography, written in 1876, when he was 67 years old, and the manner in which it was adjusted into a published text by other people. Literary scholars are well aware that autobiographies do a lot of things, culturally speaking. Alison Winter, a historian of psychology, wrote in 2012 that the act of remembering and committing memories to paper always takes place in a cultural setting. An autobiography, she said, is a story told the way that the author wants it to be told. And I want to add to Alison's remark the way that subsequent editors have adapted Darwin's text to tell new and slightly different stories, each one speaking to their own concerns. So my three protagonists are Darwin himself, as the author of his own recollections, and then his son Francis, who edited, rearranged, and published these recollections quite some time after Darwin's death. And lastly, his granddaughter, Nora Barlow, who restored omissions and republished the manuscript in 1958. This 1958 book is the one through which many readers first encounter Darwin as a person, including myself. It's a charming piece of writing, perennially popular, and much appreciated by anyone who thinks seriously about science. And today, I'm going to explore the way that it also carries cultural resonance, as Alison Winter suggested, not just as a source of information about its author, but also as a representation of what many readers have come to value as the ideal characterization of a scientist. So a word about life writing first. The 19th century English-speaking world produced an astonishing number of autobiographies, memoirs, and biographies. It was the period in these islands when the Dictionary of National Biography was conceived. Exemplary biographies were published by the thousand, and the commemorative genre of lives and letters flourished. The conviction arose that the life of a nation could be told by the lives of its people, fully supported by Thomas Carlyle's statement that the history of the world is but the biography of great men. Readers, like most of us today, evidently wanted to know about the individuals who had achieved something notable in their lifetime. And two scholars recently called that century, the 19th century, the era of heroic reputations and exemplary lives. So I'm going to be exploring both of those concepts. And we only have to think in the modern period of the popularity of, let's say, Michelle Obama's autobiography to recognize the same interest in notable and exemplary individuals still continues apace. So many public figures of the 19th century were noted autobiographers. John Stuart Mill wrote a fascinating study of himself, as did John Henry Newman, each describing the personal transformations that led them to self-discovery. Edmund Gosse adopted techniques from Victorian novels to disclose the rigors of his family's fundamentalist faith during his boyhood. The novelist Charles Dickens did the reverse by putting his autobiography into fictional form. And we tend to forget that readers probably didn't know a great deal about famous individuals' lives before the publication of a memoir or an autobiography or a biography. Newman's Apologia pro vita sua was published in his lifetime and revealed his theological struggle and conversion to Catholicism that, among many other things, led to the founding of the Catholic University of Ireland, later UCD. Mill's autobiography was written in 1853, but not published until 1873 after his death. His intention, he said, was to stop the mouths of enemies hereafter. He recorded the famine of his emotional life before he met his wife, his extraordinary education, and mental crisis at the age of 20. And both these texts, and others like them, can be seen as efforts to make the author's private world accessible to the lay reader. And indeed, we can see the same thing taking place with Darwin's autobiography. Newman and Mill probably wished also to stake their claim on the intellectual and spiritual movements of the day and reinforce their authority to speak on such matters by revealing the many obstacles that they overcame. Such aims were well-established characteristics in the autobiographical genre. Prominent members of Darwin's circle wrote about themselves in similar vein. Thomas Henry Huxley produced an autobiographical essay opening with his birth in a room over a butcher's shop in May 1825, really a substantial social difficulty that he overcame very forcefully. Alfred Russel Wallace and Herbert Spencer wrote 2 big volumes of autobiography apiece, documenting their initial disadvantages. And Darwin, too, in something of the same way, shared these authorial traits. Darwin's text was called by him Recollections of the Development of My Mind and Character, and was mostly written in May 1876, as I've already said, when he was aged 67. Here we've got a photo of Darwin. It's the closest date to 1876 that I could find. It's an 1878 photo of Darwin. The Darwin perhaps many of us are familiar with the beard, the rather anxious expression. And funnily enough, we see this overcoat in almost all the photographs that were taken after about 1860. So he had a favorite coat which he wore for photography. The photo was taken by his son Leonard and was influenced by the work of Julia Margaret Cameron. And at the same year, Darwin arranged to have a veranda, an outside area, added to his home, where this second photo on the bottom right was taken. Leonard also took this photo of his father looking out over the garden. The strange rectangle that you can see in the back of the photo is the drawing room window that seems to have reflected back into the photo. And this is an image of Darwin's autobiography. It's a very poor image, I'm awfully sorry. It comes from an extremely elderly microfilm made of the whole Darwin archive in the 1970s, when microfilm was the latest technology. And that's why it's so dark, and nobody has ever thought to redigitize it since then. Darwin's manuscript of The Development of My Mind and Character, written in 1878. This is the front page of the manuscript. He's made a table of contents, and I've written out on the left what his headers were. Like many autobiographers, he saw his life in terms of the places where he lived. The Voyage of the Beagle, of course, was what he thought was an extremely important event. But mostly it's the houses, places where he lived. And he added, the actual manuscript is 120 pages long. He wrote it all in 1876, and then quite a few years later added a substantial number of words on the back of the first 40 pages, and that was in 1880. So despite this table of contents, it seems that Darwin's text was not intended for publication. In 1879, he told his friend Victor Carew, who had translated all his books into German, that he never dreamed of publishing his own autobiography. And he said at the start of this manuscript, "I know it would have interested me greatly to have read even so short and dull a sketch of the mind of my grandfather written by himself, and what he thought and did and how he worked." It was clearly, at the time of writing, intended to be a private family document written for his children. It's organized chronologically, and the last entry was actually made in 1881, the year before his death. Here is the house where Darwin lived. At this time, he had purchased this house in 1842, and he lived there until his death. Excuse me. His family at that point were grown up and were living in other places. Quite a few of his children were living in Cambridge, England, and the house was rented out for a little while. The family used to go back for the summer vacations, and then it was turned into a girls' school, being, as you can see, of the size appropriate for a girls' school, and later on was purchased and turned into a museum, which I will mention in due course. The immediate motivating factor for Darwin to begin writing an autobiography was the news that his son Francis and Francis's wife Amy were to have a child, and that Darwin would become a grandfather for the first time. The baby, called Bernard, who is here in this picture, was born in September the same year, 1876, the year that the autobiography was written. Desperately, unhappily, Amy died in childbirth, catapulting the family into turmoil. And Francis Darwin and the baby came to live with the older generation in Darwins House. And naturally enough, Darwin stopped work on his recollections and only returned to them later to add a long passage about his own father. During this period, immediately after Amy's death, Darwin asked Francis, who's here in the image, to copy out the long manuscript of his autobiography in order to give him something to occupy his mind. Whether this was a good idea or not, one can hardly guess, but it meant that Francis thereafter had a highly emotional connection to the text. There were other reasons that pushed or incentivized Darwin into writing his recollections. 2 years previously, his cousin Francis Galton had published a survey of the mental and religious characteristics of contemporary scientists, published in 1874 as English Men of Science, Their Nature and Nurture. Galton had asked Darwin to fill out a lengthy questionnaire, and on reading the book, Darwin said he was astounded. We can retrospectively see that much of what Galton described about traits running in families were mostly due to social circumstance and education. Darwin was nevertheless impressed by Galton's demonstration of a hereditary predisposition towards science. And his fourth son, Leonard Darwin, was equally impressed and became an avid eugenist, following in Galton's footsteps and later becoming president of the British Eugenics Society from 1911 to 1928. So Darwin felt interested and engaged by the notion that what he had to say about his mental development and his characteristics was not only of interest to his family, but perhaps was even tracing out some hereditary link. There was another push a little earlier when his son, William, the oldest son, asked him to sit for a portrait as a family memento. And this was completed in 1875 by Walter William Ullas, somewhat to Darwin's unease. I look a very venerable, acute, melancholy old dog. Whether I really looked so, I do not know, he said to his friends. The portrait was exhibited that summer at the Royal Academy, and it now hangs in Darwin College in Cambridge. A matching portrait of Emma Darwin was also completed, and that has been in the family for very many years and has remained mostly unknown to scholars until the current generation of Darwins produced it and allows it to hang in Darwin College next to this portrait. And some of you may be familiar with Christ's College at Cambridge, which has a copy of this portrait. So there are two of them. So the portrait was perhaps a factor, but the final incentive, which I particularly want to mention, was that Darwin had had a bad fall from his horse and had an extremely sore leg that confined him into an invalid chair for at least 3 or 4 weeks. He was the kind of author, the kind of person who found it impossible not to do anything, and he was unable to sit quietly. He began to write. So Darwin's document is a very straightforward narrative describing the main events of his life. He comes over as a very nice person, humble about his achievements, and affectionate towards his family and friends. The style is pleasantly conversational. There are no accounts of emotional crises, no moments of catharsis. By contrast, in real life, as Darwin scholars will know, there were a number of pivotal events, including the exciting time in 1838 that he stumbled on Malthus's notion of human beings struggling to survive, or when he opened the letter in 1858 from Alfred Russel Wallace that revealed that Wallace had thought of the same theory as himself. Darwin hardly goes into these events. To be fair, he does dwell on the death of his child Anne, which had given both parents so much emotional pain, and he gave an honest and quite lengthy analysis of his personal views on religion. One thing that's missing is his income. He did not discuss his income. He evidently felt that some topics were appropriate for reflection, whereas others were not. Especially noteworthy is the way that Darwin emphasized his intellectual self-determination. I consider that all I have learned of any value has been self-taught, he declared. Looking back, he reckoned he had learned nothing at school, nothing from his father, who considered him a very ordinary boy, nothing from 2 universities, except that which was achieved by himself. Everything he accomplished on his voyage, he claimed, was through his own hard work, even criticizing his captain, Robert Fitzroy, who had done everything possible to make the voyage successful and had encouraged him after their return to write the travel narrative that set Darwin on the path to fame. Continuing in the same vein, he separated himself from any evolutionary ideas derived from Lamarck or his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, and said he could not believe that evolution was in the air. He hardly mentioned Robert Chambers or Herbert Spencer's theories of evolutionary development that preceded his own, or the fact that Spencer coined the phrase, survival of the fittest, by which Darwin's theory became known. So this was an account, we can see, steeped in the individualism of the Victorian era. It seems to me that he was writing a form of capitalist autobiography, where by skill and personal effort, the author's difficulties were turned into gains. These recollections, very charming as they are, were shaped by history, even as he wrote them down. So the story looked rather different when published by his son, Francis Darwin, in the edited volumes, The Life and Letters of Charles Darwin, issued in 1887, 5 years after Darwin's death. Here is Francis with his brothers on the left at the Darwin Centennial Celebrations, 1909, and here he is a shade earlier in 1906, painted by William Rothenstein, another family portrait. So the first thing to ask is, why did the family decide to publish it? Why was Francis so keen to publish it? The remaining archives of letters indicates that there was considerable discussion about this between them. Darwin's wife, Emma, played a key role in allowing it to go forward. She thought that others might be interested in Darwin's recollections. Nonetheless, much has been made by historians of the fact that she asked for 2 or 3 sentences to be removed in which Darwin expressed contempt about Christian doctrine. And the first of these is well known. He said in his autobiography, "I can indeed hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true, for if so, the plain language of the text seems to show that the men who do not believe, and this would include my father, brother, and almost all my best friends, will be everlastingly punished. And this is a damnable doctrine." Emma Darwin said that she was very concerned that a number of friends and some family members would be shocked by this. Even though she personally was sure, and she wrote this down, so I know that I'm okay in saying this, even though she was sure that few Anglicans of the day believed in a literal hell, she still found her husband's words offensive. Raw was the word she used. She has been accused of being a theological policeman because of this request to remove the sentences. I think it was unjust. Her own faith was waning, as described by her daughter. She perfectly well understood that her husband possessed an entirely secular mind and strongly objected to the words of the Anglican Creed, yet he could hardly be called an atheist. In sentences that were not edited out, he recorded that he had felt conscientious doubts since the Beagle voyage, and that at the time The Origin of Species was published, he deserved to be called a theist. As Jim Moore has shown, as Jim Moore has shown, Darwin could not find any evidence of a beneficent creator amid the pain and suffering of the world. And most Darwin scholars now agree that he rejected established doctrine, but occasionally admitted the possibility of a first cause. So the sons bowed to their mother's wishes and removed this sentence and another couple that distressed her. It should be noted, however, that other passages that Darwin wrote about his religious beliefs were left intact by the family editorial team. So it wasn't total censorship. Less frequently noted is that the sons also removed a completely different kind of paragraph relating to Darwin's unpleasant controversy with Samuel Butler over publication of Darwin's memoir about his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. In 1879 or so, Butler accused Charles Darwin, of plagiarism, an attack that threw him in a very poor light. And the boys did not think it reflected well on their father and took it out before publication. So what did Francis Darwin do with Darwin's autobiography? He was a skilled editor. He divided his text, his father's text, into 2 chapters in the first volume of Life and Letters and gave it the title of Autobiography. He added supporting material from his siblings and included an account of Darwin's daily routine and scientific practices. He asked Thomas Henry Huxley for a chapter on the reception of The Origin and supplied plentiful data at the end of the book, listing the awards and honorary memberships that signaled Darwin's high status in the field. He added some family photographs that made Darwin into a familiar figure. These details mark a shift towards the manufacture of Darwin as a scientific hero. The sons, as it were, became the guardians of the flame, almost professional descendants. I was interested to hear that we'd had an Academy discourse recently on celebrity culture, because these boys of Charles Darwin did not become celebrities, but they sort of marketed Darwin's celebrity in a rather interesting way. Francis Darwin soon produced a single volume life of his father. Further along, he reissued the autobiography on its own, which ran to 4 editions and was reissued frequently until the 1940s or so, as well as commemorative volumes and selections from his father's notebooks. Here's just a brief overview of the sorts of things that Francis was doing. He was very assiduous in producing books about his father and the works of his father reissued. At the end of the century, he edited the very handsome collected edition here that's in red, bottom of the screen, of Darwin's works, published in the UK by John Murray and by William Appleton in the United States. So all these activities show Francis Darwin and his brothers as primary agents in codifying Darwin's posthumous scientific eminence. There were, of course, many reasons that Darwin's work was being discussed and accepted and still controversial. This kind of proliferation of books, I think, adds to Darwin's scientific notability at the turn of the century. His qualities, Darwin's personal qualities, which I'm sure were completely genuine, were reified by Francis Darwin into those of the ideal man of science, someone who transcended national boundaries, someone whose science transcended national boundaries, who pursued his ideas despite religious opposition, who acted courteously in the face of criticism and nobly hesitated before publishing. So Darwin's personal account of Darwin fills out the moral character of the man. And these qualities, juxtaposed with Huxley's account of the critical responses to the origin of species, the difficulties that Darwin had to overcome, they reflect late 19th century ideas about the heroic. Darwin's life, I think, was presented as exceptional and at the same time edifying and reassuringly representative. What I'd like to emphasize as I move onwards is the way Francis Darwin portrayed his father as a hard worker. To showcase this mental labor was a significant biographical move that took its impetus from the busy, productive, self-made man of 19th century industrial society, and the qualities that were venerated in public figures, such as the explorer, David Livingstone, or military heroes like the Duke of Wellington. As Stephen Shapin, the scholar, the historian, has argued, the Christian ideals of saintly self-dedication and austerity were being transferred to the idealized man of science, and in Darwin's case, a non-religious man of science. It was a life in which individual effort and personal virtue featured prominently. One could perhaps say that it was an autobiography in Francis Darwin's construction that expressed the Protestant work ethic of the era. Darwin's life and character were being shaped by his son, the figurehead. So a more complex and less heroic Darwin appeared in Nora Barlow's 1858 edition of Darwin's Autobiography. Here is Nora Barlow, and these are the books that she edited that relate to Darwin. Barlow was Darwin's eldest granddaughter, one of the 3 children of Horace Darwin, the founder of the Cambridge Scientific Instrument Company. She was also the longest lived, dying at the age of 103. She was born in 1885, the same year as Gwenravarat, her cousin, the artist. Neither of them had ever met their grandfather, who had died a few years beforehand. Her life's of great interest to historians of the early 20th century, for she was one of a very small group of women actively researching Mendelian plant genetics in Cambridge with William Bateson, just as genetics was taking shape as a new field of inquiry. Bateson's circle included all the major geneticists of the day, including Hugo de Vries, who visited Cambridge in 1909 to attend the Darwin celebrations that were held at that point. Nora was only 24, but was very impressed to see him, de Vries, that is. As a young woman, she studied plant genetics at Cambridge from 1906, working on the primrose, and extending her grandfather's theories about the different forms of flowers on plants. She later continued this work in association with the biostatistician R.A. Fisher. She was childhood friends with Gregory Bateson and accompanied him and Margaret Mead to Bali in 1936 on their wedding tour. So she must have been a very good friend of the two of them. Another thing that was remarkable about Nora Barlow is that during the interwar period, she began to explore Charles Darwin's life in more detail. Her uncle Francis had died in 1925, which no doubt encouraged her to approach the family heritage from the perspective of a scientist rather than a descendant. Given the task of sorting her Uncle Francis's papers in the botany school in Cambridge after his death, she discovered a pencil sketch of her grandfather, of Charles Darwin, made by George Richmond, clearly as a preliminary to the more well-known portrait taken in 1840, just after Darwin's marriage to Emma. We see the two of them here. Nora found the pencil drawing on the left in the basement of the botany department. And after it was authenticated and all the proper things that have to be done, it was given to the university library in Cambridge to hang in the manuscripts room, where so many of Darwin's papers, and there's family papers as well, are housed. So the pencil sketch is a very handsome one. The one on the right is the one that's more familiar. That was also by George Richmond in coloured chalks. It's a watercolour. In the same year of 1929 that she found this image, and remember her Uncle Francis had died, in the same year in 1929, the old house, Down House, was opened as a museum under the auspices at first of the Royal College of Surgeons, financed by an altruistic surgeon, George Buxton Brown, who's here on your screen. Brown put his substantial assets into purchasing Darwin's home as a gift for the nation to commemorate Darwin. And it was furnished with furniture and paintings and all kinds of things from the surviving Darwin family members. And here it is on the right, being opened in 1929. So it must have seemed to Nora Barlow that a new era of Darwin studies was opening, in which writers were much more inclined to consider the psychology of the human mind and the origins of creativity. Many biographers of the era drew on Freudian theory and the modernist experimental fiction of left-leaning intellectuals. Gwenravarat was a distinctive member of the Bloomsbury group, although Nora stood mostly on the outer rim of that circle, although still part of what Noel Annan called the intellectual aristocracy. During the Second World War, while her husband Alan was away, she began to edit Charles Darwin's Beagle manuscripts afresh. Her commitment was to the disclosure of an unvarnished inner Darwin through unpublished manuscript sources, such as letters, autobiographical writings, notes, and diaries. This, which sounds so obvious today, marked a turning point in Darwin studies, though we may now think that an interest in the private records of a remarkable thinker is only to be expected. A focus on personal manuscripts was then relatively innovative, both in the history of science and in the history of literature, and reflected a wider fascination with mental development, psychological traits, inner vision, and achievement. Gwenravarat was similarly intrigued by the impact of modernity on the older generation and wrote her own recollections of growing up in the Darwin family in Period Peace, published in 1952. So Nora Barlow transcribed Darwin's autobiography anew. She restored omissions, and she published the full version in 1958. She considered Darwin to be one of the secular moderns. To her, the fading of doctrinaire religious opinion was the key to the rise of modern science. And she set about publicizing Darwin's loss of faith, his lack of faith, in order to promote what she saw as the dawn of rational thought. She included in her edition of Darwin's Autobiography letters from Emma Darwin to her husband about his faith, as well as Emma's written request to remove sentences from the earlier edition produced by Francis. She added letters relating to the Samuel Butler controversy and a number of personal documents that added depth to Darwin's reminiscences. The book played a significant role in the celebrations in Britain and North America in 1959, the year after she published, that marked 100 years of publication of The Origin of Species. The main celebratory meeting was held at the University of Chicago, as described by Will Provine, Betty Smokovitis, and others, and made visible the synthesis of classical genetics with natural selection theory, paleontology, and population biology. And what you can see here is a picture of 9 of the most eminent biologists of the day, literally making visible their agreement on the processes of evolution by natural selection. So it's nowadays customarily referred to as a synthesis of all these different parts of biology under the banner of Darwin's original ideas about natural selection. So Chicago, 1959, was a significant moment in the history of biology. The meeting also provided a venue for Julian Huxley, who was the grandchild of Thomas Henry Huxley, to promote a form of evolutionary humanism in the face of continuing religious opposition to evolution in the USA. Nora Barlow had, as it were, opened up Darwin's agnosticism for discussion. The door was ajar for renewed interest in discovering Darwin's actual views on religion. So I'm coming to a conclusion now. By the time of his death, Darwin was one of the most celebrated scientists in the world. He's still controversial in places today, but is undeniably an icon of modern science, at the same time as his biological ideas have become the basis of modern biology. However, it hardly needs to be said that what we now call Darwinism has been built and rebuilt since he published On the Origin of Species. And my good friend Peter Bowler has amply demonstrated the shifts and contingencies inherent in this lengthy historical process. What's interested me greatly in thinking about Darwin's autobiography over this time span is that his afterlives are as revealing to historians as the actual life that he lived. His words come to us filtered through layers of historical context. And what does this have to tell us about the process of understanding historical change? The rush of Darwin biographies from 1960 onwards suggests that writers saw the principal feature of Darwin's life to be the tension between science and the religion of his day. I don't want to undermine that conviction. I've wished merely this evening to draw attention to the way that autobiographical sources such as Darwin's come to us clothed in cultural context and are not always as straightforward or revealing as we might hope. So with this, I end my address and say thank you for listening so patiently. And I'm very happy to make way for David Livingstone, himself an expert on responses to Darwin's ideas, who's going to make some remarks before we move into the question period. So thank you again for joining me for this discourse, and welcome to David. Over to you.
Thank you, Janet. Well, it's a very, very great pleasure to provide some reflections on Professor Brown's discourse today. I've been a great admirer of Janet's work for a long time, and have constantly found inspiration in her writings on Darwin, the history of biogeography, and the history of science more generally. What I'd like to do in my response is actually to use Janet's lecture as the launching pad for a few more general thoughts on the whole issue of recounting scientific lives, the possibilities, but also the perils of that enterprise. So first then, I want to concur with the view that biography and autobiography are hugely important sources of information about a scientific life. There can be little doubt that they provide essential insight into the mind and life of their authors. And I'm going to use that thought as the stimulus for a few remarks in what I'll in a minute or two refer to as telling lives in science. Secondly, Darwin's own autobiography contributed to what Janet has elsewhere described as an image of science separate from its surroundings and untainted by political or cultural constraints. I think that what Janet's after here is that Darwin could, from time to time, present himself in a rather monochrome fashion, divorced from the spheres of everyday life. As she noted, his financial circumstances, his emotional life, his medical conditions, things like this were, as she has described it, evidently taboo for a writer at the time. Now, this suggests to me that we might need to think about the different arenas in which life is lived out. And I'm going to call that, secondly, placing lives in science. And finally, Janet notes the way in which leading figures, including scientists, have been presented with heroic reputations and exemplary lives. At the same time, authors of autobiographies could be gripped by the horror of post-mortem dissection, as Janet colorfully described it elsewhere. John Stuart Mill's autobiography, she reminds us today, was intended to stop the mouths of enemies hereafter. And these comments prompt then a few thoughts in me on what's at stake in what I'll call judging lives in science. So then, telling lives in science, placing lives in science, and judging lives in science. So first, telling lives in science. Now, there's no doubt that biographical works are of huge importance in getting to grips with the development of scientific thought. Bob Young once observed that biography was the basic discipline for historians of science. Why? Because, as he put it, and I quote him, biography is human nature on the hoof, embedded in lived contradictions, replete with the mediations and articulations of social, familial, and historical life. Biography, he remarked, links ideas like a reclining Gulliver to the ground of place and time. At the same time, though, telling lives in science is a complex operation. Recall Albert Camus' perceptive remark that when seen from the outside, other people's lives seem to form a whole, while our own lives on the inside are all bits and pieces. Now, I think that opens up a critical space between a life as it is lived and a life as it is told. I think I'd also add that it's not just outsiders who see people's lives as a whole. Autobiographers can impose precisely that same thing on themselves. As Janet remarked of Darwin's biography, he structured it as though, and I quote her, his life was one long saga of authorship for which the Beagle voyage was a transformative preparation. Now, precisely that species of thing is a problem for the biographer too. We may know that Darwin set sail on the Beagle in 1831, or that he published The Origin of Species in 1859. But Darwin didn't know that in the years before those events took place. The temptation to, as it were, teleologize is a constant danger for autobiography and biography alike. Second, placing lives in science. Here I take as my cue some observations by the Canadian political philosopher Charles Taylor. In scrutinizing the sources of the self, he found himself irresistibly drawn to what could be called the spaces of selfhood. In developing this thought, he remarked, "I define who I am by defining where I speak from, in the family tree, in social space, in the geography of social statuses and functions, and also crucially in the space of moral and spiritual orientation within which my most important defining relations are lived out." Now, what I draw from this is that placing a life in its diverse spatial circumstances might uncover both the messiness and yet the richness of a life as it is lived. It suggests that who we are is intimately bound up with where we are. Now, two hints at what might be gleaned from pursuing this idea, I think, are evident from Darwin himself. First, as Janet knows better than anyone else alive, the biographer of Darwin encounters a number of different Darwins. Darwin the experimenter, Darwin the traveler, Darwin the invalid, Darwin the investor, Darwin the dupe of quack medicine. We find a Beagle Darwin and a down house Darwin, a family Darwin and a public Darwin. To different audiences, Darwin presented himself in different guises. In different venues, different Darwins surfaced. Darwin, in fact, projected different selves when he was engaging with his family at home, with Fitzroy at the captain's table on the Beagle, with his ex-club friends in his study, with Dr. James Gully at the hydropathic home in the Malvern Hills where he took the water cure treatment. Asking the question, which is the real Darwin, might not be helpful. Indeed, it might even be mistaken. Second, what might support this thought is the connection between what I want to call location and locution, namely the ways in which different sites of speech are governed by different conventions. Now, there are far-reaching consequences here. Speech spaces, as I call them, shape what can and cannot be said in particular venues. They shape how things are said and how they're heard. For in different arenas, you see there are different protocols for how to manage speech. There are subjects that are trendy, and there are subjects that are taboo. In formal gatherings and in private drawing rooms, in courtrooms and in churches, in clinics and in clubs, in all these venues, different things are speakable, but also unspeakable. Now, in her lecture, Janet made several references to Darwin's thinking on religion. And crucial here, of course, is what I'd call family space. A sensitivity about what could be said at home was something that leading naturalists sometimes reflected on with their friends. The botanist Joseph Dalton Hooker, for example, spelled out the dilemma in an 1865 letter to Darwin, in which the social pressures for conformity were perfectly explicit. It's all very well for Wallace to wonder at scientific men being afraid of saying what they think, Hooker wrote. Had he as many kind and good relations as I have, who would be grieved and pained to hear me say what I think, and had he children who would be placed in predicaments most detrimental to children's minds, he would not wonder so much. Now, concerns like these, I think, easily spilled over into anxieties about what a person was comfortable saying in more public arenas. Darwin certainly felt the moral pressure. As he himself remarked, he found it, and I quote him, a fearfully difficult moral problem about the speaking out on religion. Now, this, of course, makes it extraordinarily difficult to ascertain just precisely what he or Hooker really did think about certain subjects. For as Matthew Day reminds us, the penchant for deliberate and sometimes dissembling cultural self-fashioning could be particularly conspicuous when religion was the subject of conversation. Thirdly, judging lives in science. In her remarks in Francis Darwin's Life and Letters, Janet notes how this work marked a shift towards the manufacture of Darwin as a scientific hero, one with qualities that were exceptional and edifying. That kind of moral judgment on a scientific life, though, has recently escorted us towards very troubled waters. Let me illustrate. I'll begin with Darwin. This year marked the 150th anniversary of Darwin's Descent of Man. And in an editorial last May for the journal Science, the Princeton anthropologist Agustin Fuentes lauded Darwin's achievement. But he paused nonetheless to draw attention to the racism and sexism he said that he could discern in that volume. The sort of thing he had in mind was Darwin's portrayal of the indigenous peoples of America and Australia as having lower intellectual capacity than Europeans, and the ways in which Darwinian language was used to justify imperialism and colonial expansion. The subsequent letters that the journal received from a number of high-profile scientists, including Jerry Coyne and Sir Walter Bodmer, disclosed, to put it mildly, great dissatisfaction with Fuentes' judgment. Among their concerns was the fear that his exposition would, and I quote, encourage a spectrum of anti-evolution voices and thereby damage the next generation of evolutionary scientists. Well, now it seems to me that the biographer ferreting out the motivations and beliefs of scientific heroes could turn out to be a very tricky business indeed. Sensitivities on all sides make this a quagmire. Let me stay in the same territory. As we heard tonight, Darwin's uncle, Francis Galton, was a founding father of modern eugenics and developed regression analysis as a statistical means of examining what he considered to be a serious decline in the quality of English families. Darwin's son, Leonard, became president of the Eugenics Education Society. And another son, George, was a member of the Cambridge University Eugenics Society. It turns out, too, that Sir Ronald Fisher, a key architect of the modern synthesis that used mathematical models to integrate Mendelian genetics with Darwin's selection theories, he was mentored by none other than Leonard Darwin. Fisher, too, was deeply committed to eugenics. Indeed, it's been argued that eugenics was crucial to the fundamental contributions that Fisher made to genetics and to the development of modern neo-Darwinism. Recall, too, that Theodosius Dobzhansky was a member of the board of directors of the American Eugenics Society. Is there a pattern here? No matter how you look at it, it seems that eugenics, Darwinism, and genetics were closely intertwined. Now, there are pitfalls on every side here. On the one hand, Ernst Mayr, the distinguished historian of science, insisted that eugenics was merely contextual, not constitutive at all for the development of biological thinking. On the other hand, Gonville and Keyes College, Cambridge, under pressure from activists, have recently removed a stained glass window commemorating the research of Fisher. The Darwin lineage, of course, isn't unique here. My good friend Nicholas Rupka has been under attack for his comments on the racial thinking of Thomas Henry Huxley, largely on account of a campaign to remove Huxley's name from a lecture hall at Western Washington University. Alexander Winchell, the distinguished American geologist, has had his name deleted from one of the student dormitories at the University of Michigan because of his 1880 book on the pre-Adamites. The same thing happened to Stanley Porteous, an Australian-born psychologist at the University of Hawaii, due to his research during the 1920s on race and intelligence. All of this is simply to draw attention to the perils of judging lives in science, and to wonder, given the context of our own time, how historians really should treat the virtues and the vices of our scientific past. For, to me at least, the pure and simple fact of the matter is that writing lives in science, if I could quote Janet's colleague Stephen Shapin, is rarely pure and never simple. Janet, thank you for a most stimulating discourse today. And now it's a great pleasure to hand over to the Academy's Senior Vice President, Professor Jerry McKenna, who will chair our question and answer session. Thank you.
Well, thank you to our speakers, Janet and David. We've had a number of questions come in, and we'll have time to cover a few of those. One of them is, how would Darwin react to Darwinism? And it's come up in some of the answers and then the comments that David and Janet have made. How would Darwin react to Darwinism as it is used today in psychology, sociology, economics, and business?
Is that one for me, David?
You can both answer.
The correct answer, Janet, is yes, it's one for you.
Yes, right. Well, I was also going to say, thank you, Jerry. It's a question where I think, were Darwin to come back and to read and see what was going on today, he would be very intrigued. And I think, given that we now know so much about genetics that he didn't know, that he would be following and agreeing with a lot of what is being suggested today. I can't speak at length or even shortly about the four various fields you've mentioned, but evolutionary psychology, for one, whether I follow it or agree with it or not is a different matter, but the question was, would Darwin? And I think the answer would be yes, insofar as I could guess. I'm not Darwin. It's a very difficult question to answer, but I would say yes. He would be very interested in what's going on today.
Maybe I'll just...
Darwinism has become synonymous with something beyond evolution, it has to be said. Mm-hmm. So perhaps, David, you would want to comment on that as well.
Well, just a comment, I think, Vice President. I mean, on the one hand, in Darwin's own day, Darwinism and evolution were often used to justify certain kinds of wiping out of native peoples and things of that sort, and certainly could be used in certain contexts to justify, for example, the rightness of slavery on the basis of superior races. Now, whether Darwin was supportive of colonialism or not, we certainly know that he was absolutely opposed to slavery. And he came from a whole family of abolitionists, which Janet knows much more about than I do. But I think that he would have been discriminating in those applications of the theory of natural selection to subjects to which it might be less appropriate. I think also one thing about Darwin in my reading, and Janet, of course, can correct me in this, natural selection, while I think the main mechanism for evolutionary change, was never regarded by Darwin as the only mechanism. Sexual selection, correlative variation, things of this sort. Whereas my feeling is that certain modern Darwinians kind of think that natural selection is the only game in town. I think Darwin might have been interested in a conversation about that.
Thank you. We have a question. Janet mentioned the presentation of Darwin by his family as an international figure. Was he also understood as a distinctly English genius, a representative of national achievement in his own country?
The English, I perhaps should say the people of the United Kingdom during Darwin's own lifetime regarded him as a national hero, yes, and were very proud of him. The questioner perhaps already knows that Darwin was buried with a tremendously celebratory funeral service in Westminster Abbey in central London, a place where kings and queens and heroes are buried. And many of his friends and contemporaries felt that was totally appropriate, and the newspapers afterwards spoke about it in that way as a great national hero. I don't believe he became an international hero until the North America, the United States in particular, took it upon themselves to adopt a great deal of the evolutionary way of thought, particularly when the turn of the 19th century, as capitalism became so very emphasized in the United States, a number of the emergent wealthy individuals like Mellon and Carnegie spoke to their companies, their businesses, running according to natural selective models, that they were competitive, there was selection, there was success. So I don't think Darwin was he was a scientific hero until the end of the 19th century in the United States, and then he became a political hero, so to speak, or an economic hero, and by default, thereby international. I perhaps should not have used the word international, as we know it's a complicated word. I would hesitate to suggest that Darwin was ever or is now a hero in Southeast Asia. I simply don't. He's got global reach through the acceptance globally of his theories, but as a hero, I'm not so sure. So I'm sorry to give such a yes and no answer. Your questioner perhaps they will realize that a historian always says yes and no.
We accept that. The question, there have been a large number of Darwin biographies, including the celebrated one by yourself. Does there need to be a new Darwin biography for each generation?
Thank you. It's a really interesting question. I believe probably the answer is not necessarily one for every generation, but it's a good thing. Why ever not? It all adds to the richness of our intellectual environment. There are already, there have been lots since I've published, which I read religiously. It's going to be hard for somebody to find something newish to say unless a lovely new set of manuscripts turns up.
David, would you like to comment on that as well?
Yeah, sure, I would. I've thought about that a good deal. I mean, I don't want to reduce every biography of Darwin to the autobiography of the writer of the biography. But as Janet said, I think in her talk tonight, frequently Darwin is being staged in certain ways by biographers, whether consciously or unconsciously. Biographers, like everyone else, live in their own time, and that also is going to have an influence on how they frame the questions that they want to ask of Darwin. So, I mean, I think an intriguing thought experiment would be perhaps in an age when there is a reassessment of heroes, and when there is a suspicion more and more of great name history and so on. What kind of biography could be written that would address those kinds of concerns and their wider intellectual significance? I don't know if Janet has thought about that, but it strikes me that when we think about metabiography, this is exactly the kind of thing that we're looking at, that figures can be, as it were, kind of dressed up for staging in a particular way at a particular cultural moment. What they tell us about Darwin is a separate question and an important one.
Thank you. It's a recognition that Darwin, a lot has changed in biology, particularly since Darwin's time, in terms of knowledge, particularly of genetics, of which he didn't know a great deal, and molecular biology, of course, didn't exist then. How significant is Darwin's work for understanding evolutionary biology and genetics today, and is it indeed relevant at all?
Well, you're speaking to somebody who stopped researching biology in 1972. So my impression of having very many friends who are modern evolutionary biologists is that they don't need Darwin on a regular basis. They need the idea of natural selection, which David's already mentioned is a key part of what contemporary biology covers. Sometimes they don't actually feel the need for the thing we called sexual selection, which was one of Darwin's notions. And they don't need to consult the origin of species on a regular basis, because clearly it's totally out of date in the practical biology that he discusses. And yet every biologist I know has a deep and abiding respect for Charles Darwin. And they do read The Origin of Species because they find he has a way of thinking about the problems that is very evocative and thoughtful, that inspires them, and that they respect the way he did so much work of such a tremendously detailed nature. They admire his caution and ability to make sure things were right before he published. So there's lots and lots of discussion and praise for Darwin in the circles where I move. And of course, natural selection is used a great deal. So it is something that creates a bridge between me and what I'm working on and what biologists are working on. But I think if I'm remembering the question correctly, that there's not any necessary reason for biologists today to go back to Darwin to use his ideas.
Thank you. David, do you want to comment further on that?
I'd like to just say a couple of things about that. I mean, I do think that the general paradigm, I suspect, though I know nothing about contemporary zoology or anything of that sort, but I mean, I think that adaptationism still remains a fundamental concept in explaining variation and the survival of variations and so on. I mean, I think that the scale at which Darwin felt natural selection operated, that the whole organism has been to some degree replaced in genetics with much more, smaller scale sorts of genes and alleles and the like. But I would also say this, and it really picks up something Janet said at the end about connections that a historian of science like Janet can have with contemporary geneticists and zoologists and so on. I also think it remains a kind of unifying set of ideas that links right across from philosophers and social scientists to the scientific community. And in an age where we've become more and more specialist, befuddlingly specialist, I think that it's still wonderful to have some ideas that really do go across these boundaries and at least facilitate the possibility of some conversations, such that I think people working in history like me can benefit a great deal from listening to what a contemporary geneticist says, and I think from listening to what a philosopher says as well. So I think it performs still a unifying task with respect to at least understanding something about the species transformation.
Yes, and I think he remarkably unified biology at the time when it was necessary for that to happen. You obviously studied Darwin in great depth in his life and what he did. Do we know what, if any, association he ever had with Ireland?
He was reviewed by Samuel Horton, the professor of geology at TCD, critically. He was friends with John Tyndall, who had spent many, many years and was Irish on the Irish Geological Survey. He never visited Ireland. He had, and this really is a question for David, because he had a number of professorial critics and responders in Belfast, but as the whole of the island, it was not a closed space for him, but he had very little opportunity to meet many figures who lived in Ireland. So not many connections there. I'm sorry, it would be difficult. He was a member of the Royal Irish Academy.
He was.
Early on, 1864. But he could have come and studied the geology when he was an active young man. And I believe there is even some talk of that in early letters, but he never did.
Well, I just add a little comment there. Of course, Janet knows the biography extremely well. It would be mistaken, though, to think that Darwin was not talked about, as we both well know. He had actually a remarkable achievement in Ireland, particularly the north of Ireland, which is that he succeeded in uniting both Protestants and Catholics against himself. Okay. So when John Tyndall, the Irish physicist, came and gave that famous Belfast address in 1874, the horror that was expressed both by the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, the bishops and archbishops, and also the Presbyterian hierarchy in Belfast was something to behold. So suddenly, this unholy trinity of Spencer, Darwin, and John Tyndall was battling for against another trinity, let's put it that way. So he certainly was widely talked about. In fact, that debate, I think, was a shot that echoed around the world, the one that happened at the British Association. It was picked up in newspapers all around the world. I mean, for example, in South Africa, there was a complete printing of the debate and things of that sort. It was picked up in the American South. It was picked up in New Zealand, all around the place. So whilst he may not have set foot on Irish soil, his name was well embedded in the intellectual landscape.
Thank you.
Thank you. The Origin of the Species is a remarkably readable book for scientists and non-scientists alike. Did that, do you feel, presage in any way a way of writing for science which has helped communication subsequently?
Gosh, that's an interesting question. I agree completely that The Origin of Species and Darwin's other books are remarkably personable, almost conversational. He can convey a great deal of very sophisticated information in an easy style. He was writing a book about science at a time when science itself was shifting to put important results in journal articles. So the vehicle of a book was even a little bit old-fashioned in his own time. Not quite, but in 10 years' time after The Origin of Species, most of the significant new findings were being published in journals, not in books. And books became popular books, science for the people. So I think Darwin's style does spread through into the popular books of science for the people. We could perhaps name a few authors who do that. Even Julian Huxley did that extremely well. But the high-level results that The Origin of Species was aiming to put over, they kind of migrate into new journals like Nature, science, and other kinds of things.
Thank you. Well, regrettably, we've run out of time, and all that remains is a sincere thank you to Janet and David, and to all of you for your questions, answered and unanswered. I'm sure you'll agree that this was a most enjoyable and interesting Academy discourse. I would also like to thank our sponsors, Mason Hayes and Curran, LLP, for their support, and the Secretary of the Academy, Mary O'Dowd, MRIA, for organising the Academy's discourse programme. The next Academy discourse will be Confessions of a Disappointed Irish Unificationist by Lord Bew, Paul Bew, MRIA, Emeritus Professor of Politics at Queen's University, Belfast. And the response will be delivered by Jennifer Todd, MRIA. The event will take place on the evening of Thursday, the 25th of November. Further information and booking details will be available on the Royal Irish Academy website, www.ria.ie, in due course. And I hope that you'll be able to join us then. In the meantime, stay safe and good night.